Today, I'm speaking in a short interview with Darion Akins, the Consul General of the United States of America in the Hanseatic city of Hamburg. Thank you for the invitation, sir. I really enjoyed being in the so-called White House close to the Ulster. The consulate was founded in June 1790 as one of the first US consulates located in Germany. It has seen the stormy history of both nations. It stands as an institution for social and political change and international cooperation. The General Consulate and its staff not only performs everyday diplomatic work, but also cooperates with many democracy and cultural initiatives in the north of the Federal Republic. Thank you for taking your time for us, Mr. Akins, sir, Consul General of the United States in Hamburg. Thank you. First question, first impression. What was your first impression of Germany, and which kind of, let's say, mental picture of people and the country itself did you have in mind when the decision was fixed that your next diplomatic station will be Hamburg?
I did not particularly have a mental picture in mind at first. Well, wait a minute, that's not true. If I were honest, I did have one. And that was that Germans were, everything has to be in order. Germans are very much on time. Germans are very clear and sometimes very direct. But that was, I guess, my initial stereotypical mental image. What was even more interesting is that as I began to talk with colleagues and people who had visited Germany before, and they learned that I was going to Hamburg, they said, Northern Germany, so I have to give you a piece of advice. I said, okay, now what's that? Well, Northern Germans tend to be quite reserved. So initially when you meet them, don't panic if they are a little bit reserved and calm and quiet and closed. Don't take it personal. Over time, you will see that as you meet them the second, the third time, it will become a much warmer relationship. And actually, I found that to be true. As I've developed relationships and met people multiple times, I've learned that yes, on initial meeting, Northern Germans can be reserved, but as you get to know them over time, you have the possibility to develop a warm and lasting relationship.
Yeah. It was actually one experience I made too. That after 1 hour of conversation, where the typical Northern German say only one word, it could have been a very warm and welcome conversation. Most people are looking on world politics, the big sky stripes of history, the newspaper headlines. From my point of view regarding countering hate and violent extremism or anti-democratic attitudes, the more important places of engagement are the tiny spots of, let's say, everyday life, the neighborhoods, families, voluntary life, actually. What is your opinion to this topic, and how can governmental institutions support their plural development within the people's communication or between the relations of the people?
I think that we have to look at the relationships because I think that they're quite important. And dare I say, perhaps maybe it's akin to a marriage, but let's just say it's akin to a relationship. And with any relationship, we choose who we enter in that relationship with, and then that we have to then nurture it and take care of it. We cannot think only about ourselves. We have to consider the other person and the relationship in general. And this requires compromise because it's not only about one individual. By definition, in a relationship, you're at least talking about two people. And two people who are really focused on having a strong, enduring relationship think about the relationship itself and what does the other person need, what can I contribute, and I think that's very important. In terms of what the government, what role the government can play, I think that the governments have established their role. If we look at, for example, the German and American constitutions, we've established the ground rules, that we've established that certain freedoms will be protected and people are allowed to express those freedoms. And so, for example, people under the American Constitution have, just like in the German Constitution, have the right to freedom of expression. And when they take issue with certain policies or certain undertakings, then they have the right to assemble and protest. And those are rights to make sure that we are continually having a dialogue about what we feel is the best way to take care of our democracy, to nurture our democracy.
Yeah, very true, sir. Sad but true as well, we are facing far right-wing extremism and racism all over the world. The Montgomery bus boycott, for example, and the braveness of Rosa Parks has been 65 years ago this year. Very often there are individual democracy activists and small groups who pull other people with them and inspire them when it comes to civil rights. Personalities who were humble and yet stand like, let's say, solitary lighthouses in human history. Rosa Parks, Käthe Kollwitz, Sophie Scholl, Martin Luther King, Mahatma Gandhi, or Nelson Mandela. Do you think that despite all the influences and distractions in modern social media, we have a chance of reaching young folks in Germany, Europe, and the USA with these, let's say, classic ideals?
I believe we do. These iconic lighthouses don't only exist in the past. I think we can see the beginnings of the light from people today, because every generation is defined by the era in which they live in. And there are issues that we're facing today. You brought up the issue of kind of hate or extremism. Those are issues that we're facing today, and I think that people will rise to the challenge and be able to face those challenges. And so, but what is particularly important is, when we experience hate and we see that kind of behavior and activity, that it has to be universally condemned, but we have to do that in coordination. And here's where the relationships matter, like these potentially future lighthouses, because I've seen them here in Hamburg. I've met young people here who I think I will hear from, even no matter where I go in the world, I'll probably hear from them. But we have to do that in coordination. That means that we have to make sure that we have dialogue, not just within one place, but as extensively as possible between our two countries, with other countries, to make sure that these ideas that we all support in terms of how democracies function and so forth, that they're being able to share those ideas together.
So to keep the stories alive, to keep the biographies alive, that those people telling something to us and even the next generation,
Well, because you have these individuals that, as you mentioned before, these iconic individuals, they've paved the road, and so there will be people who come behind them who pick up that mantle and say, for our era, this generation, this is the issue that we face, and this is the issue that we must address. But they do that with a sense of history, these individuals that have paved that road.
Yeah. I was fellow of the International Visitors Program, as I told you, of the US government some years ago, and I enjoyed it very much. It has been an inspiration for me to meet democracy boosters all over the US, and I particularly remembering a Jewish American family who lost their relatives themselves in the Holocaust, and who warmly invited me as a German for dinner in Minneapolis, Minnesota, to get to know each other better. In addition, the SBLC, the Southern Poverty Law Center in Alabama made a great impression on me with its fight against the Ku Klux Klan. How can we succeed in strengthening the basic virtues of democratic societies, namely listening to one and another, recognizing the needs of the other, and accepting each other as equals?
Well, I think that you've provided the answer in your question. Honestly, it truly is listening to one another. I think if we cannot listen to one another, then we cannot move forward. So it is listening to one another and then making an enduring connection. In terms of listening to one another, I mean, a good example of this, and we all know the story now, I mean, in the wake of George Floyd's death in the United States, people came out to express what they felt was, to express their views and opinions. And they, in that process, they're defining what is acceptable, what is unacceptable. But in order to do that in democracy, you have to have a conversation. It doesn't mean compromising your values, but it means being willing to have dialogue. And then I go back to, in those kinds of situations where it is, like I said, we have to universally condemn hate, and we comprehensively condemn hate, but we have to do that in coordination. But that's an example of where it's very important in democracies where you have individual groups who come out and say and define what are the parameters of that society. How is the society going to function? And I think that democracy lends itself to that.
Yeah. So we can say, I mean, there are some freedom is provided for every individual, but the border of the single freedom of one individual seems to be the dignity of your neighbor, for example.
Well, and I think that that's ultimately what we have to realize. In some ways, you know, it is that I am my brother's keeper. In a lot of ways, it is that. Because how can I think only about what my needs are? Because in order to progress, in order to provide the protections and the freedoms that come along with the democracies that we live in, I have to recognize that there are other people involved in that process. And I have to understand them, and I have to dialogue with them, and I have to live next to them, I have to work with them. And so we need a common understanding. And the only way we can do that is by expressing our views and then making sure that we're listening when people are speaking.
That keeps democracy alive.
It does.
At the end of the day. Yeah.
It does.
The RAA is a small NGO that aims to develop both educational institutions and rural areas as well. We have been working in partnership with the US Consulate General in Hamburg for years in a trusting and successful manner. We have also exchanged scientists and civil rights activists across the Atlantic Ocean several times. Do you see lines of change in the American-German relationship in the near future, and what can we do to deepen the partnership between the two countries, but also the cooperation on site?
So I think that institutions like RAA are important and key to what we can do in the future. But also we have to continually establish these connections. And that's what you do. I mean, RAA is a grassroots organization working with people at the lowest level, you know, at the grassroots level. And I think that that's important. But when we look at this over the long term, what do we do to nurture our relationships, like the transatlantic relationship? I really believe that it is absolutely critical that we begin to redefine the transatlantic relationship based in its history, but also looking at it from the point of view of young people today. What are the issues that most affect them? What are they most concerned about? And being able to have a dialogue about, well, how can we face those challenges together?
They definitely differ from the parents' perspective.
It definitely does, and we need to recognize that, you know, there is a change from generation to generation, and we have to recognize when the next generation comes along and says, I understand the history, but today, this is a more pressing issue. So now, what are the mechanisms that we can do this, that we could strengthen the transatlantic relationship? There are multiple ways, but I'll talk about two. One is, I think that exchange programs are critical. So you yourself have participated in the IVLP program. It doesn't matter what type of exchange, just the mere fact that Germans go to the United States and Americans come to Germany and they experience the culture, the language of each of those places and get to know people, because that becomes the basis of building relationships, long-term relationships. And that's on a grassroots level. And then there are things on an institutional level that we can do. We have sister city partnerships that also support these exchanges. They can do it in terms of on an economic basis. There are some that do it on a cultural basis. But that's a formalized structure in place to say how important these relationships are, how enduring they are, and that we are going to continue to work together on these issues, on a set of issues. And so I think that those are a couple of ways that we can continue to move forward and strengthen the transatlantic relationship.
Nothing more to say. That's very good. Thank you, sir. Thank you so much for having us here.
Good. No, thank you.
Okay.